In this chapter, you'll begin a deeper understanding of the law of supply by focusing on the costs of production. Costs are something that businesses are very familiar with. However, they are also things that we as consumers ought to be mindful of. So in this chapter, you'll begin to understand that for a business, their goal is to maximize their profits. Now, some businesses may have some qualifications on that behavior. They may desire to maximize profits within a certain, maybe a level of social responsibility or environmental responsibility. Other businesses wish to maximize profits, and those really aren't a concern for them. So you will discover there's a variety of terms, costs and profits and terms that you're going to use in this chapter. For example, there is a difference between explicit and implicit costs. Explicit are those costs that are directly paid, and implicit are costs, but nobody's actually paid those costs. But it is a trade-off. It is a cost of business. It's indirect. You also have fixed and variable cost. Fixed costs are those costs that stay the same regardless of the quantity that's produced, whereas variable costs will vary as the quantity produced varies. There's also a difference between what's known as economic profit and normal profit. And this is mostly due to the fact that economists will look at both explicit and implicit costs. All of those costs matter to an economist because they represent an opportunity cost, a trade-off. Accountants often don't include implicit costs because they're indirect, but economists want to focus on opportunity cost, the full cost that's being traded off. And so we make a distinction between normal profit and economic profit. Another factor that businesses will concern themselves with have to do with a perspective of time. In particular, in the short run, there are some fixed inputs. For example, you might be limited in terms of the number of machines that a company has. So in the short run, they're stuck with the one factory machine and that's it. But in the long run, everything becomes variable. If they need another conveyor belt, they could add another conveyor belt in the long run. Not necessarily something that they could add this afternoon. So long run and short run don't have anything to do with how much time is involved. It has to do with whether or not there's something that's limited, something that's fixed. Businesses are also very aware of what's known as the law of diminishing returns. And that simply says that as more and more units of a particular factor are used, the marginal product will decline. So imagine you had an office space and you hired one worker and they produced a certain amount of product. And in that same office space, then you added 2 workers. Maybe they work together and do a little bit better. But then you start to add 3, 4, 5, 20 workers into a 10 by 10 foot closet, and you don't get a lot of product out of that last worker. So law of diminishing returns is something that businesses are very careful to observe. Businesses are also very mindful of the costs, and in particular, their average costs. How much are these costs per unit produced? So in this chapter, there's a variety of cost curves that you're going to explore. Average fixed cost, which always declines the more you produce of something. Average variable cost, which declines and then rises again. And average total cost, which declines and then rises again. And then there's marginal cost, which after some point, it will always increase. And then we'll take the long run perspective and focus on the long run cost curve, which goes down and then back up again. In the area where long run costs are declining, you have an area that's called economies of scale. So In this area, a company experiences economies of scale when they produce more and the costs actually go down. But then they experience an area called constant returns to scale. Getting bigger doesn't really change their average costs. And then they might experience an area where getting bigger actually increases their costs, and that's what's known as diseconomies of scale. And this is the long run perspective. So in summary, you ought to begin to understand the difference between fixed and variable costs. You ought to understand the relationship between the law of diminishing returns and marginal cost. And you begin to understand that marginal cost always goes up the more a product is produced, because there's a limit to how much resources that are available. These are terms and concepts that are crucial for a business to understand if they want to maximize their profits.